Good evening and welcome, everyone. Thank you for tuning in tonight. My name is Kate Bruns, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I am so pleased to introduce tonight's talk with Tracy K. Smith, presenting Lucille Clifton's 1976 memoir, Generations, newly reissued by NYRB Classics, joined in conversation tonight by Joshua Bennett. Through virtual events like tonight's, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to our ever-expanding community. We host virtual events like tonight's 5 times a week. You can find our event schedule on our website at harvard.com/events, where you can sign up for our email newsletter and browse our bookshelves from home. This evening's event will conclude with some time for your questions. If you would like to ask the speaker something, please go to the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen where you can submit a question. We'll get through as many as time allows for this evening. Also, if you would like closed captions available, please click the live transcript tab on your Zoom screen. In just a moment, I will be posting the link to purchase tonight's featured book, Generations, in the chat box. Your book purchases make virtual author events like this possible, and they support the future of a landmark independent bookstore. So thank you for tuning in tonight. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. And finally, as you have likely experienced in virtual gatherings, technical issues may arise, and if they do, I'm going to do my best to resolve them quickly. So thank you for your patience and your understanding. And now I am so pleased to introduce tonight's speakers. Tracy K. Smith served as the 22nd Poet Laureate of the United States and is the author of 5 books of poetry, which include The Body's Question, Duende, Life on Mars, winner of the 2012 Pulitzer Prize, Wade in the Water, and most recently, Such Color, just published this October. She's also editor of an anthology, American Journal, 50 Poems for Our Time, and the memoir, Ordinary Light. Tracy currently teaches at Harvard University. And tonight she's joined in conversation by award-winning poet, performer, and scholar, Joshua Bennett. Dr. Bennett is the author of the book of criticism, Being Property Once Myself, the poetry collections Ode and the Sobbing School, and the forthcoming book of narrative nonfiction, Spoken Word. He's currently professor of English and creative writing at Dartmouth College. Tonight, the two will be discussing Generations, the 1976 memoir by the poet Lucille Clifton, reissued this week by the New York Review of Books Classics, with an introduction by Tracy K. Smith. In this classic work of innovative memoir, originally acquired by Toni Morrison when she was an editor at Knopf, Clifton traces her family history back through Jim Crow, the slave trade, and all the way to the women of the Dahomey people in West Africa. During her lifetime, Lucille Clifton was the winner of a National Book Award and a 2-time finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, best known for her collections Two-Headed Woman, Next, Good Woman, and Quilting. We're so pleased to be hosting this special event tonight. So without further ado, Tracy and Joshua, the digital podium is now yours.
Kate, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. And thank you, Tracy. Hello, how are you doing?
I'm so grateful and happy to be here in conversation with you. Thanks for joining.
Of course. It's an honor and pleasure. Thank you for taking the time out to talk. And thank you for the beautiful introduction to this book. I've been poring over it for the past week in preparation for today, and just set sparks off firing in so many directions. One, it made me think about one of my favorite Clifton poems, which is also titled Generations, which maybe we could talk about a little bit later. But it got me thinking about literary stewardship, right? And what it means to live in a moment where so many Black contemporary poets are telling us to actually look back towards the tradition for the tools we need for today. And so in that spirit, I was wondering, would you mind reading us just a section from the introduction?
Absolutely, I'd love to. Thank you.
Of course.
What is our relationship to history? Do we belong to it, or is it ours? Are we in it? Does it run through us, spilling out like water or blood? I think the answers to those questions, at least in America, depend upon who you are, or rather on who you've been taught to believe that you are. If the history you descend from has been mapped, adapted, mythologized, reenacted, and broadcast as though it is the central defining story of a continent, perhaps you can be forgiven, up to a point, for having succumbed to a collective distortion. But what if yours is a history the wider world once recorded not as lives and feats, but as articles of inventory, men, women, children listed according to their age and value as property? What if the largeness of those lives, what they endured, yes, but also what they carried, remembered, witnessed, and made, has been hushed up, negated, overwritten, or outright erased? What if the recovery of your full story sheds stark light on the lie of that other, louder story? There it is, light. It took 3 paragraphs to creep in as a metaphor, though it runs through the work of Lucille Clifton like life force. Light comes to her, light speaks, light emanates from the figures of history and myth, like Lucifer, God's bringer of light, whom Clifton claims as her namesake, and who, in her rendering, testifies, illuminate I could, and so illuminate I did.
It's gorgeous. It's beautifully read, beautifully written. So I'm curious, what illuminated the oeuvre of Lucille Clifton for you? Was there a teacher, an experience, a poem you overheard on a train? What was your introduction to her work in the first instance?
Well, my introduction to her work was as her student at Columbia in 1995. I was in a poetry workshop with her in the fall, and getting the word that I was going to be working with her, I turned to learn, who is Lucille Clifton? I'm ashamed to say that I didn't know. I hadn't read her work as an undergrad, shamefully. And so I was reading her on the page while gathering a sense of her in time and space. And that was amazing and formidable, but also warm and welcoming and vulnerable. Like, she talked very openly about her grief and about her belief that the relationships that she had lost to death persisted through dialogue from the other side. And that was remarkable to me because I was grieving the loss of my mother, and I wanted to believe that one day, maybe if I could become a poet that was, better than I believed myself to be, maybe one day I'd have the tools in language to broach that kind of faith that she had. And then reading her work on the page, it was different from most of the work that I had somehow studied and as an undergrad or even in my reading life as a student. There was this commitment to Black life and Black voices and ferocity of conscience, right? If you read a Lucille Clifton poem and don't feel discomfort or don't feel that you too must change, there's something that you're not paying attention to. And that was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time, to recognize, indeed, she has tapped into something big.
Do you feel like that at all has inflected or affected your own relationship to teaching? Because I had a very different set of questions actually about the life of the writing, but now that I know that you were sharing that workshop space and now you're about to teach a workshop, in your current post at Harvard, how do you see those resonances even still from Clifton, from the beyond?
Well, I don't think I started my practice as a teacher with the confidence that would allow me to kind of think in real time about what I was feeling and needing as a human and how poetry could speak to that. But I believe I'm willing, or perhaps I need to do that now. And so the searching that I'm doing in language, which is, for me, it doesn't end in language. Ideally, it ends in the kind of illumination or clarity or even fright that those encounters with the real in Clifton's and others' work look like. That's what I'm looking for. And so I invite that sense of wish or possibility or credulity into the workshop, even as we're talking, okay, what are the tools and craft that can help you get farther into this project.
Wow, that's powerful. Okay, so you're making me think now then about the relationship between poets as sort of contemporary stewards and their teachers, in particular, Wanda Coleman and Terrence Hayes. Yeah. So it seems like we're living in a moment now where not just sort of Terrence is helping reintroduce Wanda's work for a new generation, but also someone like Christopher Gilbert, I think, right? Then you have Araceli's Gourmet, who just wrote a new introduction, right, for the selected poems of Lucille Clifton. I'm curious, because we've talked a little bit about teaching already, what is it about this kind of social and political moment, I guess, that is inspiring folks to turn back to these older poets and seemingly not revise, but revisit their legacies, right? As teachers, as artists, as writers for the younger generation? Or is it just a coincidence? Because I think that'd be interesting too. But do you have a sense of that?
I have a strong sense that it's not a coincidence. I used to say that many of the lessons that I learned from graduate school didn't really sink in until a decade later, when I was like, living in the world and trying to use my practice as a poet to keep living, to ask the right questions and be courageous to listen and follow toward a new kind of clarity or revelation or chastening. And so I feel that what might call many of us to these kind of formative voices is that we hear something in them now that wasn't legible in this to such an extent before. For me, what I mean is Clifton's work seems to, it was alive and useful in the, every decade in which she wrote, but in some ways it seems like she was writing for the 21st century. She was writing for this moment when everything that we thought had been resolved in our lazy sort of, like wishful comfort is, ripped open and chasing after us. That's a bad metaphor, but it's undone, and it's demanding to be contended with properly. And so when I look at her work and I think about the ways that Black life is cherished, but that's not the end of Clifton's project. Sure. I believe what she's saying is, if we are to be able to make good on our humanity, if we're going to be able to face whatever exists after this human life, loving one another across lines of racial difference, that's the first baby step. But we're not going to be able to properly tend to the planet. We're not going to be able to properly love ourselves. We're not going to be able to think toward futures unless we can take that first step. That first, step that it seems to be like very, very difficult to take. We're looking at hundreds of years of unwillingness to say, maybe there's a way that we ought to mean something to one another.
Oh, that's beautiful. That's beautifully stated. You got me thinking about Clifton and the planetary now. And actually this line on page 61, where she's describing her father's funeral and she says, everything cried, right? And based on what I've read of Clifton, my sense is she's saying it's almost biblical, like the rocks are crying out, right? The sky cries out, the plants and the animals. Can you talk a little bit more about your sense? Because you're also someone I've taught as a kind of eco-poet, but with an interstellar sensibility, right? Can you talk a little bit about Clifton's ecological vision and maybe why that is important for us right now in this moment?
I think about it a lot. I thought about her when I moved into this house where next door there's another house going up. And so all these trees, one day I was looking out and I was like, I'm so happy to be here. And there are these trees. And then one day they came and started cutting down many of these trees. And I thought, I've come to live among the killers of trees, thinking of Clifton and what a gesture that seems as small and practical as clearing a patch of land to build a home. If we step back far enough, what we can see that as, which is a kind of slaughter, a kind of wanton sense that we humans, with our, commitment to capital, can make choices about not just the lives of other people, but the lives of other living things. Clifton urges me to see that the desecration of the earth is of a piece with lynching, is of a piece with enslavement. And she talks about, I mean, her argument is also willing to move across, both sides of that sort of, simple divide. And so she'll say the earth is a Black and living thing. And suddenly what that does is it tells us who believe that Black life is beautiful and vibrant and vital and necessary, that reverence extends to other things as well. That reverence extends to what we ride as beings in space. And so it pushes me to do a better kind of work, right? I can't say it's just my people that I want to think about. I can't think honestly about them if I'm not thinking about the power dynamics that are replicated in other ways.
Yeah, no, I think that's precisely right. So you're making me think now about this distinction she makes about 10 pages after, I think, that, Everything Cried line, where she talks about the difference between people and families, right? She talks about moving into this new town and saying the white folks were people, but the colored folks were families. And she doesn't mean blood kin, right? She says we were families sort of beyond, right? And so they were my play cousins, if not necessarily my blood cousins. So, I mean, I'm thinking then about Clifton and kinship, right? There's that famous anecdote that part of the reason that the poems are so short, and I imagine the memoir too, right, was because she had those 6 kids, right? In between one going to bed and one waking up, she had to be able to write and memorize these things, right, and put them on the page. Can you talk a little bit then about what Clifton has taught you about kinship?
Well, I want to look for a minute at the book. I don't have the quote in my head that you're referring to, but there are a couple others that it reminds me of.
Yeah, sure.
So she says, there's a moment, it's on page 21, where, let's see, she would never say nothing to me about her mama, but sometimes she's quoting her father. She would never say nothing to me about her mama, but sometime when I was a boy, I would sit with her and Aunt Margaret Brown, who was her sister, while they rocked on the porch. And I would hear them talking about, do you remember different things? And they would say about, do you remember Nat Turner's forays when we just got here? And do you remember John Brown and the war between the states? And Mammy Caroline would smile like at Aunt Margaret Brown and say, I'm glad you survived it, sister.
Yes.
And I wonder what become of our mama. And they would just rock and rock.
Wow.
There are a lot of moments like that. There's another moment later in the book where her father says, we fooled them, Lou. Slavery was terrible, but we fooled them old people. We come out of it better than they did.
Yes.
And that them and they, I think, is a white them, a white they. But what both of those passages really remind me of is what was built and forged in the living through those times and beyond. A care, we talk about like an ethic of care now, but that was real, right? Attending to, even across separation and distance. And then the amazing, resourceful, creative, generative capacity to make good, make a way. And I feel like it can't happen. That type of survival, creation, and generosity comes from a largeness of soul, and it fosters an even greater largeness of soul, right? Interiority. We think of slavery as a process of a practice that's dehumanizing, but I think it dehumanized not us.
Yeah.
And so family is this powerful, indelible thing across the many erasures.
My goodness. Can I share with you my favorite passage from the book?
Oh yeah, I'd love to hear that.
And it's maybe it is undoubtedly one of my favorite passages in all of American literature. I cried rereading it. And so this is from her first week at Howard. This is on page 76. about a letter her father wrote her.
Mhm.
My daddy wrote me a letter my first week there, and my daddy could only write his name. But he got this letter together and it said, "Dear Lucille, man, I miss you so much, but you are there getting what we want you to have. Be a good girl, signed your daddy." I cried and cried because it was the greatest letter I ever read or read about in my whole life. Mama wrote me too when her letter said, "Your daddy has written you a letter and he worked all day."
Mhm.
It's astonishing. Like it brings to mind that Komanyaka poem, right, where he talks about his father sort of laboring to write the apology, where he's almost redeemed by what he tried to say. Right? And there's something there that I just think is a largeness of soul, like you say, and a capacity for mercy, forgiveness, reflection. And she just sees him, she sees him from all these different complex angles and writes that for us beautifully. We talked a little bit before we got into, the event as such about parenthood, especially during the pandemic. I'm curious, how, if at all, did reading this memoir, writing towards it, writing the introduction for it, help you reflect on what it means to be not just a poet that is a parent, but a poet who's written about your parents, who's had your father as a, I'm speaking from experience, or my dad's on the cover of my last joint.
Mhm.
How, if at all, has Clifton's legacy kind of helped you, in this book in particular, helped you think about that practice of writing one's father into literature?
Yeah. Well, the gratitude I feel being guided time and again through Clifton's ancestry and the kind of almost like prayer that her father gives her, beginning with Mammy Kellen and coming down through to her.
Yes.
And it's something that he instills in her. I mean, so much of this book, which, the premise for this memoir was the death of her father, the passing of her father. And that brought back to her all of this other history that he fed her and gave her and convinced her of.
Yes.
I feel rewarded by that and enlarged by that. There's a moment where he's talking to her and she says, "But I worried, was this written down anywhere? Is there anything that could corroborate this? I worried that maybe some of it was wrong." And I also understand that apprehension or anxiety that we're taught to bring to sifting through our Black ancestry in this country, where inevitably you reach an impasse. If you're like most of us, there's something that she does that allows me to leap past that worry and say there's something there and it is real and it's not gone. That's the other thing that I think is so amazing. Not only are these people invoked, but we know through her practice as a writer and as a human, they persist.
Yes.
They are available to her. You can think about that in metaphorical terms if you want to. I choose to think about that as fact.
Yes.
There is existence that needs us to do something for it and is also there to help us do that thing for us. So her bringing that into literature, I think, is huge. And it makes me want to do still more, to move beyond what I believe I've done is to think these are my parents. I miss them. I need to remember them. And I think that has been really important and useful. But she makes me want to go beyond that and say, but they are a part of this big we. The planet needs this we to reconfigure itself and do what only it can do. Yes. And so I'd like to find a way through my writing, contribute to that project.
Beautiful. It's like that moment in Toni Morrison's Sarah Lawrence commencement address where she says there's a distinction between our children and the children, right? All of the world's sort of children, these vulnerable people that depend on us. And so I love the idea that your poems are reaching out towards that untold multitude. One quick housekeeping thing, anyone who's watching, if you have a question, please feel free to post it in the Q&A because things are about to speed up a little bit. Tracy, would you mind reading some of the poems from Lucille Clifton that have been guiding lights for you?
Yeah. I had a few things marked, and I wanted to start with a poem that it's called "Why Some People Be Mad at Me Sometimes." It's one of the brief poems that you can imagine. If you believe, and I tend to believe that the story of writing brief poems because the kids were napping is one version of the amazing prophetic compression that runs through her work. But I'll read it, and I want to say there's something, and I think Toni Morrison touches on it in her introduction to this collected poems. There is a way that Clifton's work has been, by some readers, made easy and genial and comforting and jolly. And I believe that is perhaps conscious or maybe even unconsciously a wish to denude it of some of that fire that singes all of us, and particularly a white reader, because the project of whiteness, which isn't congenital, but it's something that all of us are steeped in and many have not yet decided to resist, is something that she's critical of. So this is a poem that I love, and I also read it because there's, I think, a way that it can be read and sort of just chuckled at by somebody who's not willing to go the distance with it. Does that make sense to you a little bit?
Yes.
Okay. Why some people be mad at me sometimes. They ask me to remember, but they want me to remember their memories. And I keep on remembering mine. And so that's one, it's almost like an aphoristic view of history that comes through that poem. And then I want to read a couple other poems that go further into the sense of the danger that would cause someone to titter at a poem like that, perhaps, or just say how quaint or how, and this is one of her untitled poems. I am accused of tending to the past as if I made it, as if I sculpted it with my own hands. I did not. This past was waiting for me when I came, a monstrous, unnamed baby, and I, with my mother's itch, took it to breast and named it history. She is more human now, learning language every day, remembering faces, names, and dates. When she is strong enough to travel on her own, beware, she will. And so the promise and threat of history seen clearly begins to approach, right? It's harder to laugh at, to chuckle at a poem like that. But there are other poems of hers that I feel give us another view of what she's after, what light means for her. Yeah. And so I'll read you a couple of poems that offer that. This is another untitled, but the first line is so iconic. The light that came to Lucille Clifton came in a shift of knowing when even her fondest sureties faded away. It was the summer she understood that she had not understood and was not mistress even of her own off eye. Then the man escaped throwing away his tie, and the children grew legs and started walking, and she could see the peril of an unexamined life. She closed her eyes, afraid to look for her authenticity, but the light insists on itself in the world. A voice from the non-dead past started talking. She closed her ears, and it spelled out in her hand, "You might as well answer the door, my child. The truth is furiously knocking." So that's one other glimpse of the light as fierce. Like I think of all the things that terrified me reading the book of Revelation as a child, all the conflagrations, and like that's a version of truth there, right? From one system of myth or history. And here's the last poem I'll read right now. It's called Roots. Call it our craziness even, call it anything. It is the life thing in us that will not let us die. Even in death's hand, we fold the fingers up and call them greens and grow on them. We hum them and make music. Call it our wildness then. We are lost from the field of flowers. We become a field of flowers. Call it our craziness, our wildness, call it our roots. It is the light in us. It is the light of us. It is the light. Call it whatever you have to. Call it anything. And so, what I hear in that is this truth, this thing being pulled toward an us that is raced, that is Black, and that is beautiful and complicated. And then, of course, in all those poems, you hear this really powerful and prophetic marriage of the vernacular to, the oracular, to, the language of the King James Bible, or at least the rhythm and inflection of it, the silence, the spaciousness of it comes through there. And so if you're really listening and you don't want to just be sitting in a reading and smiling at what, is easy, then you're thinking, I have to reconfigure my whole understanding of history.
Sure.
If I'm really going to take this poetry in the way that it's asking to be taken.
Wow. So then I have another question for you, actually. And thank you for those beautiful readings. Those are some of my favorites and some others, and I have to go back over again. It seems like a couple of different times you were thinking about audience, right? About the audience member that might be tempted to laugh or say something's quaint or feel like Clifton's getting them, but them is really, the person to be convicted is the one saying that, right? Who feels righteous about their sort of liberal stances. What kind of tools, what sort of instruments do you think that Clifton has left for contemporary Black poets, maybe wrestling with some of these questions of audience and reception?
Well, I think she has a powerful argument for the necessity of a Black vernacular voice, and not just voice, but the logic, the aesthetics, and the kind of like world-bending sort of like capacity of it to say many things at once, to say in a way that becomes metaphor, to say in a way that becomes a kind of choreography of movement and rhythm, and to say in a way that will make, this is a different kind of laughter, that knowing laughter. Know ourselves, we know them. I love that she's insisting upon that as the vehicle for this really big vision of humanity. And it reminds me a little bit of the way that, so many people of color or people from marginalized communities are still encouraged to clarify and make legible their material to, a presumed central reader. Clifton says no. Clifton says there are some things that you have to say in the way that you say them, and the mean in that vocabulary and in that inflection. And I want to say, like, woe betide you who do not want to lean forward and figure out, learn from that, who want it to be sort of passed over to you easily.
No, I think that's right.
I feel like that's a big part of it. I'm sure there's more, but what do you think?
What do I think? That's a good question. I mean, so for me, it's Clifton's humor that I come back to. It's the capacity of her vision. And it's something you said earlier about her willingness to take seriously a certain, what feels to me, very Black way of thinking about spirituality and religiosity, which is that it's multiform, right? So she's talking about spirit writing. A fair amount of the work brings in sort of biblical myth and Christianity. I mean, so she's taking these different pieces of these different traditions. And like what Raymond Williams says about tradition, right? It's a selection and reselection of ancestors. So Clifton for me just feels completely cosmopolitan. And again, in an almost interstellar way, like she's pulling from different cosmos to say, these are all a part of my tradition. And I bring all of this to bear, my love for music, my love for the people. I was talking to you earlier about this other poem she has, Generations. That's really about like trees and grasshoppers, where she says, by their invisibility, denounce us, you know, like these beings that never asked for war. She has these beautiful poems about oxen and foxes, right? So Clifton always, and cockroaches, she always had her eye on the least of these in this really capacious way. And so whenever I feel really stressed about audience, it's helpful to think about someone who had that kind of vision and was willing to bear it out in children's books, in memoir, in poetry, and seemed to write all of it with an ear first, right? Like the idea was that these were social poems. They were meant to be read aloud among the people. And I think that's very high stakes for any sort of poem. The idea that it's not just supposed to live on the printed page in kind of private quarters, but that every time I go to this blank sheet, I'm trying to craft something that's worthy of the gathering, you know, in the places where we gather to
It
survive.
really kind of upends that notion of poetry as a circle of experts and as a site where we are writing not to an occasion and not to an everyone and not even to, you know, something that's going to be embodied, like that version of poetry, the rarefied and the specialized, where what is sought is a kind of authority, you know, power or prowess. She takes us back to the word.
Yes.
You know, and this has always been about gathering souls, you know.
Yeah.
And she reminds us that's a bigger aim.
Yeah.
We belong to a large and powerful we don't even, we can't even see the end of it. And it doesn't just mean we belong to it, we're accountable to it, right? How many of her poems are asking us to think about accountability in these big cosmic ways?
Yes. So many.
The stakes get restored in a way.
Yes. That's beautiful. Can I ask you a question about gathering?
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like when thinking about instruments that our poets have left behind, I feel like you've really left a legacy of thinking about Black gathering and Black institutionality as bound up in important ways. So here I'm thinking, of course, about Darkroom, but also about Cave Canem. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how maybe being part of those Black collectives, those Black collectivities, those Black retreats, how, if at all, has that, one, changed your approach to the craft of poetry, but two, maybe helped you think differently about not just audience, but authority, right? Never necessarily just the star poet alone on, because lest we forget, right? Clifton was in these kind of study and reading and writing groups with Toni K. Bambara, Toni Morrison, Audre Lorde, June Jordan. And so it seems like she too, even as we might want to set her alone, like her grandma did, calling her a genius, right? Who was 12 years old for life. Somehow it's incredible, our Black elders, the things they dream up for us. The collective though was clearly formative for her and super important. So I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about that influence on you, building Black institutions, building Black collectives.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would say I would turn that and say I just feel like I've been the beneficiary of these generous spaces that are rooted in Blackness and the need or the understanding that community is something we can't take for granted, and therefore let us build. And it's not without strife sometimes, you know. You scratch the surface of the dark room and you get to a lot of crazy stories about conflict, but it doesn't undo this other huge thing of saying we belong to this tradition. Let us help one another get there, you know, and let us make it a big thing. I think about how Black poets have always, as I see it, at least in America, been insistent upon making the I, that like primacy of the I in the lyric poem, making it into a we, or a space that can accommodate the concerns and allegiances to a we. And I think that's what speaks to, when I think about the way that those voices, when I did encounter them, landed in me as a reader, like a young, aspiring writer in my 20s, I felt suddenly seen and claimed.
Wow.
Came to poetry because I didn't feel those things, but poems helped me imagine that I could gather up the tools to understand how to get that.
Yes.
Then I found these other voices. And for me, it was like Rita Dove, Yusuf Komunyaka, Thilias Moss, and then Clifton when I was a graduate student. And I was like, I am in this, and my parents are in it, my grandparents, my aunts and uncles who don't read or think about poetry, they would recognize the us in this. And that felt big in a much more exciting and hopeful making way.
Yes. Oh my goodness.
Mm-hmm. And so what happens to us who came through these groups? We are making that we of Blackness big, and we're also, I believe, reaching out to other communities that go beyond race, and something is growing that I think is really meaningful. And I love things that begin in poetry, but that are bigger than poetry, bigger than art. And I think there are things that are bigger than art. And I think that we is mindful of that. Or when it's not, we can remind one another what else is at stake,
Yeah. No, that's wonderful. And thank you for shouting out Thilias Moss too. Yeah. One of the first poets I aspired to just reflect some of that light whenever I turn to the page. Okay, so we have 2 questions in our Q&A so far. I'll start with the second one first. For both of you, what was the first poem by Lucille Clifton that really reached out to you?
Well, I think for me, it's the poem that has reached out to a lot of people. Won't You Celebrate With Me?
Yeah, come on.
Right, let me read it. You probably have it memorized, Joshua. Do you know it? Do you want to recite it?
Oh, that's great.
Won't you celebrate with me what I have shaped into a kind of life? I had no model. Born in Babylon, both non-white and woman, what did I see to be except myself? I made it up here on this bridge between starshine and clay, my one hand holding tight my other hand. Come celebrate with me that every day something has tried to kill me and has failed.
That's gorgeous. That was definitely one of the first, for sure. Another one, though, that I love is actually I named my dissertation after it, and my first book of literary theory. So this is Untitled, but the first line is Being Property Once Myself. Being property once myself, I have a feeling for it. That's why I can talk about environment. Who wants to be a tree ought to be, he can be it. Same thing for other things. Same thing for men. 8 lines, just a stunner. What's another one? Cutting Greens. Maybe we'll read that later, but that was my giant. Someone who grew up on collards and kale. Okay.
Can we talk just for a minute about that? I'm going to insist upon drilling down into the vernacular. So how that Black Southern voice, how it's migrated, but ought to be, right? Yes. The middle of that poem. We know on one level, it's doing a grammatical thing. It's connecting an idea. Well, ought to be, he could, but we also see it there as a like a directive, ought to be a statement of value, an attempt to right a persistent wrong. This ought to be, this must be. And I love that. I don't think that's absent in the vernacular, but her putting it in the poem, giving it that space on the line, allows us to see all the different things Black English has long done, you know?
Yeah. Even that syntactical shift, being property once myself, right? I have a feeling for, I mean, that's just an incredible way to open. And for me, it opened an entire world because I thought she was going to talk about animals next. But as she does in a poem like Cutting Green, she's talking about the knife, the darkness of the kitchen, right? The greens themselves. The idea is that it's live things everywhere. That's how that poem closes, right? Not living things even. So it's not even limited to the plants and the animals. She's saying like the knife, the table, all of the entities that surround us persist. And Blackness is the link between us, right? Not just racial Blackness, but this idea that Blackness is a kind of void, or as Hortense Spillers might say, a kind of vestibule where all these different forms of life and non-life can congregate together, right? And what was once called nothing will actually be proved to be a site of abundance, right? And an incredible majesty and power. So I love what you said earlier about that we can't even see the end of yet, right? And that infinitude is where, to me, it seems like almost all of Clifton's poems live, right? So the brevity feels like almost a kind of trick, right? They're just small capsules of infinity that she grants to us that we can return to over and over.
Yeah.
All right, let's talk about this second question. You both, oh, it starts with the compliments, very kind. You both talked beautifully about kinship, family, and lineage as they played out and spilled out in Lucille's writing. When I think tonight about her incomparable compression, I go back to the title of this memoir, Generations, one word that captures so much. Do you both have any thoughts about the title itself and how it might evoke some of what you talked about tonight in regards to history?
Yeah, well, that's a really wonderful question. It kind of almost answers itself for us, I think. But I mean, we look at that word and we think in a family story, it means this line, and it does. And we're reminded again and again that that's one of the things it means. But of course, something is being generated by the force of these lives, by the wake of these lives. And I think that title also reminds me of that thing, or actually those many things.
Yeah. Yeah. And different types of kinship, different kinds of outgrowths that you might not think are possible. You know, I mean, some of what she outlines is incredibly violent. That story about her father as a boy being made to sit at the corner of the bar and then having to fight all the other little boys, and you know, that being something he's proud of, right? The idea that he was sort of the champion of the bar, right? The little boy champion of the bar. And yet out of that, nonetheless, right? Out of great tragedy, out of difficulty, in so many ways, this is also a disability memoir about how people navigate the vulnerability of their own bodies. And she says out of that can grow anything. Right?
Yeah.
Out of that space of, again, what is only perceived as lack, anything is possible, including the book you're holding in your hands, right? So it's not till the end that we actually get that kind of fully drawn out family line. And as with everything in Clifton, you know, that's purposeful, right? She's saying it's not just the names, because that's what history is, right? It's filling in the feelings behind those names, the textures, the scenes that gave them life, which are these other sorts of generations, right? In which, as you know, the late Camille Aisha Moon will remind us, that's what poetry is supposed to do, is give you the feeling behind the historical fact, right? Yeah. That's our job, to bear witness to that and to be scholars of the miraculous, you know, which Clifton was and is, you know.
Yeah, definitely is. Somehow I also want to talk about the way that Whitman is
yes,
in this book as part of Generations, because she's generating an argument here, many arguments. And, you know, in the introduction, I talk about what it means to see these lines from Song of Myself right next to or soon after these images of her ancestors. And so suddenly what I think we're being invited to do is to say, this, you know, white frame of reference of Whitman as somebody who can be comfortable and confident in claiming a dominion and an authority and an ability to listen and speak for others. Yes. That's one story. Yes. But if you believe it's possible to do that, you must also understand that these voices and faces are exerting the same type of authority and presence. And what does it mean to imagine that we're told we're worthy of listening to and hearing ourselves in their lives?
Yes.
That's a project, but it is achieved in this work.
No, 100%. There's an essay or maybe even a book to be written about what Black women poets do with Whitman, because I'm also thinking about June Jordan's For the Sake of People's Poetry, right, where she takes up Whitman and seems to say, right, the language she uses is us sort of new world poets. We actually make good on Whitman's
Yes.
crime and Whitman's vision, right? We help realize it, and maybe we're unfathomable to him in certain ways in our fullness and in our complexity, and yet, right, I'm choosing to bring him into my tradition, right? So I think with Clifton, with the memoir, she's doing something similar, right? She's saying, well, this is maybe even a more robust version and vision of what you were laying out. I'm here to complete the thing, or at least continue it, let's say, in the name of sort of open ending.
Yeah.
Beautiful. On that note, Tracy, thank you again for taking the time. This was a beautiful conversation.
Yeah, I could talk all night, but it's really wonderful to share this space with you. Thank you.
Sure, for sure. Kate, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you so much. That was such a well-spoken event. I was like enraptured over here, and took me a second to turn my camera on because of it. This was really beautiful. Well, thank you both, as I said, and thank you everyone for spending your Friday evening with us. This was so lovely. And I've posted links in the chat. I hope everyone saw them, to purchase Generations, but also to take a look at Such Color and also at Ode. So thank you everyone. On behalf of Harvard Bookstore, have a great night, stay healthy, keep reading, and please be well. Thank you.